Lambda Literary nurtures and advocates for LGBTQ writers, elevating the impact of their words to create community, preserve our legacies, and affirm the value of our
Lisa,
story.
maybe we can start a little 1 or 2 minutes later, because now the live streaming is going, and that will help us to get the recording of your lecture. Sorry, I interrupted. Just 1 second. Huh?
Sure.
I was trying to figure this out. Just 1 second. We lose the recording if this doesn't. Yes, it's on.
So the title of today's talk is The Legacies of LGBTQ Literatures and Lives, Understanding the Relevance of Lambda Literary Awards. So perhaps we can deliberate upon the importance of this literary awards by reading its mission statement. So the mission statement reads, Lambda Literary nurtures and advocates for LGBTQ writers, elevating the impact of their words to create community, preserve our legacies, and affirm the value of our stories and our lives. So we all know that this is an award. The Lambda Literary Awards are based in the US, and it has a history of more than 3 decades. So each one of these purposes that are stated in the mission statement forces one to think about the emergence and evolution of the LGBTQ community and their literary works as such. Though we would like to think of people belonging to the different gender and sexual identity categories in terms of a single community, that is LGBTQ community, the diversity within this community reflects even in the eclectic list of literary genres acknowledged by the Lambda Literary Awards. One might think as to why it's important for Lambda Literary Foundation to nurture and advocate for LGBTQ writers in particular, when writers in general face challenges from the society at large. The very historical context in which the Lambda Literary Awards came into existence clearly shows the reason as to why there was a need to acknowledge the presence of LGBTQ writers. In the 1980s, particularly, when the epidemic named AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, was identified as a new disease that affected urban homosexual male, to claim a gay identity meant putting one's life at the risk of being ostracized, shamed, and invisibilized. In the Lambda Book Report, which is a comprehensive review periodical published in 1987 by the Lambda Literary Foundation, we come across an interesting observation that the gay writer Edmund White makes. To give you some background information regarding this book report, the owner of a bookstore named Lambda Rising in Washington, D.C., the person's name is L. Page Deacon McKibben, published the first Lambda book report in 1987. It had a collection of reviews of gay and lesbian literature and interviews with gay and lesbian identified writers also. In the very first issue itself, one can find an interview with the writer Edmund White, who was a winner of the subsequent Lambda Awards of 1989 for the semi-autobiographical novel, the second in a trilogy of novels titled The Beautiful Room is Empty. In the interview, he says, "No American who is gay will win the Pulitzer Prize." Again, the Pulitzer Prize is a prize that comes from the US for the that are based on the American culture and nation. So he says, "No American who is gay will win the Pulitzer Prize unless he were closeted. because the Pulitzer Prize actually has a moral aspect to it. I think that when Edward Albee was proposed for Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the committee decided not to give it to him, even though the lower recommending committee had suggested his name. One of the bylaws said it must go to someone who was moral. That's one thing. But another has to do with specialization. You would want a mainstream writer, and a mainstream writer could never be a gay one. This statement exposes the complexity of canonization that occurs on the literary front. It poses the question of literary merit and literary value that most often compartmentalize the aesthetic merit and sociocultural politics that shape a literary work. In the award ceremony, while giving his speech, Edmund White also said, "What literature differences can one become universal?" This emphasis on one's individuality that does share experiences of emotions like loss, grief, shame, guilt with other people is probably what bind the LGBT community across the world. Another writer, Paul Munit, who won the Lanta Awards in the AIDS and gay nonfiction categories for the book Borrowed Time and AIDS Memoir, in his preface to Love Alone, which is an anthology of poetry, Munit insists, "I would rather have this volume filed under AIDS than under poetry, because if these words speak to anyone, they are for those who are mad with loss, to let them know they are not alone." One can also perceive the act of writing about AIDS as a collective resistance to the invisibilization of and indifference to the experience of loss among the people of LGBTQ community. It can also be seen as an act of recording, documenting, and archiving the shifting terrain of intimacies at the time of an epidemic, how an epidemic can change the spaces of gathering into isolated places, like, say, for example, how the bathhouses were shut at the time of the epidemic. It used to be a space that allowed gay identified people to come together, and how sexual intimacies between people adopt new ways, like, say, for instance, because of the fear of becoming HIV positive, people became more conscious of having safe sex. So it, in a way, changed the way in people had intimate relationships. When it comes to illnesses in general, not just the AIDS, but other illnesses, like, say, for instance, cancer, one also becomes aware of the value attributed to human lives of people that are marked by one's gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. Illnesses like cancer and AIDS disproportionately affect the homeless queer youth and adults, and also people belonging to different racial backgrounds other than the white people's. So the 1987 book report also includes the work of Audre Lorde. There's a review of A Burst of Light, which won National Book Award in 1989 and was a finalist of the 1989 Lambda Awards. So what is so important about this particular work is that it connects race, illnesses, and sexuality with injustices. So it holds the state responsible for providing affordable treatment for the AIDS epidemics clearly become historical contexts that show one how far the LGBTQ lives were valued. Out of the many steps taken towards affirming the values of one's stories and lives, the formation of small presses can be seen as a fruitful movement that not only enabled publishing LGBTQ works, but also built a sense of community. So those people who may not be aware of the Stonewall uprising, so the Stonewall riot, which is marked in the 1969, happened to be an event wherein, the police raiding the bars and pubs where the gay, lesbian, transgender people gathered was a usual phenomenon in the US. But in 1969, in the Stonewall riots, we see the LGBTQ people protesting against, fighting against, attacking the cops back and claiming their rights. So that's the Stonewall uprisings. Well, when larger publishers avoided publishing LGBTQ literary works, by larger publishers, I mean the New York magazine, for instance, LGBTQ community people had stated that they were at that point of time very much homophobic. So when larger publishers avoided publishing LGBTQ literary works for the lack of aesthetic merit and commercial reasons, there emerged many small literary presses operated by a single or a self-publishing author or a collective across the US in the 1970s and 80s that largely adopted the narrative of coming out. After the Stonewall riots, no newspaper was ready to use the word gay because it was considered a dirty word. It was after the Stonewall uprising that we saw an upsurge in the LGBTQ rights movements, and the small presses started gaining the press power by covering the meetings, motives, movements, and literary endeavors. These small press publishers also captured multiple political goals and interests among the LGBT community. For instance, the publication of the lesbian magazine, The Ladder, by Daughters of Billionaires, which is a lesbian organization, a lesbian collective, presents diverse sentiments among lesbians and butch femme communities. So the butch women or butch trans person would be a very overtly masculine person, and the femme person would be a very feminine person. So as a couple, the butch femme would appear in the open public spaces, putting their lives at risk, but the general women's movement and the lesbian feminist movements that existed in the 1960s and 70s were largely hostile against the butch femme communities. So the first volume of The Ladder continually stresses the importance of avoiding the fly front pants and the butch haircuts and mannish manner, which are the worst publicity that they can get. They were criticized for the Daughters of Billionaires were criticized for the hostile approach towards butch femme, because they considered butch women as savages and femme women as heterosexual women who knew how to relate to men only, and hence forced butch women to play the role of men. However, this butch femme culture that is reclaimed through the novel Stone Butch Blues also tracks the evolution of a transgender movement, as the main character of the novel identifies both as butch and a transgender person. Interestingly, we see that within the emergence of small presses, there were spaces for a diverse range of lesbian women. Leslie Feinberg's novel, Stone Butch Blues, becomes the winner of the categories Small Press Book Awards and Lesbian Fiction in the Lambda Literary Awards. So it was published by the small press named Firebrand. And even the 1999 award for Sarah Waters' Tripping the Velvet was again categorized under lesbian fiction. So what I'm trying to show here is that we see fictional works like, say, for instance, Tonbridge Blues being eligible to be nominated for different categories at the same time. So even Tripping the Velvet, which can also be identified as a transgender fiction, it was also categorized under the lesbian fiction. Because the present identity categories that are available for us allows us to identify its center character, Nan, as a transgender or gender fluid character. However, in 2000, we see a shift. In 2000, David Ebershaw's The Danish Girl won the award in the category of transgender fiction. So we see in 2000, we having a particular category named as transgender fiction. Now, how do we understand this possibility of placing one fictional work under different literary categories? Well, right from the writing of Edmund White onwards, we see writers claiming their sexual or gender identity, sexual and gender identity, that is non-normative, and presenting their works as autobiographical. One can see that it is probably the desire to record the details of a subculture, like, say, for example, the butch femme bar culture, which was subculture at that point of time. Or it could be because of one wants to archive the legacy of one's community by giving the details about the different relationships that they had with the community, rather than the desire to create an artistic work that drives writers to write LGBTQ literary works. So it could be more of a political intention rather than producing an aesthetically appealing work that the writers might have. So therefore, we see emergent literary genres taking shape as people name their gender and sexual identities with new names. While autobiographical nature of a work becomes inevitable in such contexts, one is also forced to notice the bias that existed against this genre. So Leslie Feinberg says, Leslie Feinberg is generally known as a leftist transgender activist. Leslie Feinberg says, and I quote, an elitist their assumption that a blue-collar person who lacks extended formal education could not possibly write about anything except their own life, unquote. The autobiographical writing, according to the literary critic J. Prosser, becomes a body narrative, especially the autobiographical writing that appears in the genre of transgender narratives. He calls them, J. Prosser calls it a body narrative, sexual identity, and to make sense of one's own body. So largely we see transsexual and transgender identified people writing about their bodily experiences of transition. So one can see it as a way of them making sense of their own bodies. He also calls autobiographical writings trans-genre, where autobiographical accounts are merged into fiction, blurring the autobiography and fiction distinction, so as to challenge the assumption related to class binaries entwined to literary reception and appreciation. The question of aesthetic merit and political value remains a concern for writers and critics in general. While Edmund White emphasized the need to have autobiographical works, writers like Leslie Feinberg pointed out the elitism that existed on the literary front and hence called the novel a work of fiction. If you look at the main character also, the main character does not adopt the writer's name, but it is Jess Goldberg. The narrator of the novel is Jess Goldberg. But in a way, we can see resemblances to the life of the writer Leslie Feinberg. But Leslie Feinberg clearly says that it's a fictional work and one needn't call it an autobiographical work. Thus, we see the Lambda Literary Awards also accordingly forming a new category of transgender fiction in the wake of the 21st century. By 2010, we see a shift in the interest of the transgender writers particularly. By 2010, one would also notice a shift in the transgender fiction from focusing on body narrative to more broader political and social concerns and literary aesthetic experiments. The 2010 Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Fiction, Holding Still for As Long as Possible, which was written by Zoe Whittle, does not provide a testimony of bodily transformation of its character, Josh, but presents the transgender character as yet another person who navigates through the complexities of a medical field where they work and their personal romantic relationship. Then another work would be Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw, which won the award in 2010. And it happens to be an experimental prose that refers to a transgender style of writing that resembles a postmodern pastiche-like writing style that includes history, personal anecdotes, fiction, and political vision. So what we get to see over here is that we see transgender writers becoming more experimental with the form of the work. Then the collection of short stories named The Collection, short story from the Transgender Vanguard, which was edited by Tom Ledger and Ridley MacLeod. This particular collection was published from their small press named Topside Press, and it won the Transgender Fiction Category Award in 2012. As its name suggests, the collection presents exceptionally creative works from transgender writers dealing with the nuances of not just gender and sexual identities, but also presents complex narratives of one's memory being deeply entangled with one's racial background, food cultures, veganism, and social biases against various identity categories, and thus envisions a new form of resistance to the dominant by representing the cultures of the immigrant communities also. Yeah. So the 21st century categories of Lambda awards also include new genres like bisexual, gay, and lesbian, transgender poetry, erotica, photography, visual arts, and children's or young adult fiction. However, like any other awards, even the Lambda Literary Awards are also criticized for their exclusionary nature, particularly for not including the diverse LGBTQ literary works presented by racially different people. Particularly when it comes to the children's and young adult fiction category, there is this criticism that those categories do not generally consider the works of racially different people. And at some point, there was criticism from the bisexual community saying that their work are not adequately represented in the Lambda Literary Awards. There were also disagreements from the transgender community against the Lambda Literary Awards when they chose a transphobic writer. So all these kind of disagreements and disappointments do appear when it comes to the area of awards. And we also see that awards largely are exclusionary in nature to some extent. Another writer that I would like to talk about is a writer who would be widely discussed in the subsequent paper by Monica. So that's Chinelo Okparanta, who won the Lambda Literary Awards for the lesbian fiction Happiness Like Water in 2013, and Under the Dala Trees Press, which was awarded subsequently in 2016. So when we look at these works, they present cultures of both Nigeria and the US. In an interview in the 19th series of the African Writers and Poets of the Library of Congress, she says that she seeks solutions for her personal problems from fiction writing. So one thing that I noticed that even in a short story named Tumors and Butterflies, we see a very strained relationship that exists between the main character and her parents. So I mean, it's a conflict that she carries within her all throughout her lives. So probably by writing about it, she tries to find solutions for those conflicts and problems that she has against her family members itself. Then so largely she seems to be focusing on matters that matter to her on an individual level. She also notes that literature is a way by which we get a sense of connection to the rest of the humanity. While one often reads and writes in isolation, a literary work being able to connect one with the rest of the humanity, in fact, makes one think of the less talked about lives and emotions that are often silenced. Another writer, Samra Habib's We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir, which again would be discussed by the subsequent presenter, paper presenter, is another Lambda award-winning work which presents diverse range of experiences that a queer person might have. Presenting the religious identity of a Muslim, she opens the possibility of living the life of a queer Muslim person for whom religious identity cannot be removed from oneself like a garment, but is deeply embedded into her everyday life. Explaining the politics of writing and living, Samra says, I quote, not everyone is equipped for activism in the traditional sense, marching, writing letters to the officials, but dedicating your life to understanding yourself can be its own form of protest, especially when the world tells you that you don't exist, unquote. And therefore, we see in the Lambda Awards allowing the awards allowing LGBTQ people to reclaim their lives and preserve their legacies through their writings. I mean, it's interesting to see that in the beginning with the AIDS epidemic, we see even before that also, the LGBTQ people forming communities, forming collectives to fight against the state, the legal system to claim their rights. But as we come towards the 21st century, with the writers like Samra Habib, we see a different kind of a politics that do not really believe in a collective-driven activism, but an individual-driven activism, which is interesting. Then another category of Lambda Literary Awards is the children's or young adult fiction, which any reader, irrespective of gender or sexual identity, is bound to explore, I suppose. While adults might have the possibility of claiming an identity and telling their story, the world and lives of transgender children are still invisibilized and disciplined largely by our educational system and other institutions. The young adult fiction category award-winning writer, Benjamin Alir Science, for the novel Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, shows a possibility of adults supporting and making it possible for young adults to come to terms with their sexuality. Generally, while parents do not necessarily come equipped to bring up a child, books of this category offers lessons to parents and even any adult to support and help young children who identify differently from the normative gender and sexual identities. And one can help them live peacefully and safely. The genderqueer writer, Alex Geno's George, which won the Children's Category Award in 2015, and is another work that I would like to take up. We see the title of the book being changed to Melissa's Story. So the writer says, I quote, "What we call people matters. We all deserve to be addressed in ways that feel good to us. once you see a mistake, you can always make it, you can always change it, sorry. So what happens here is that initially the book was published with the title George. And later on, the writer and the publishers decided that it would be an injustice to the trans the community at large and transgender literature, because in the work, the character George identifies themselves as a girl and names themselves as Melissa. So it's important to change its title later to Melissa's story. So what is interesting and about this is that this also demands a cisgender people, particularly to put an effort to ask and know another person's pronoun and name before assuming by looking at the person. Out of all the literary genres that Lambda Literary Awards recognize, perhaps these categories of children and young adult fiction stand more relevant to the present times. In a heteropatriarchal society, the children and young adults who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender bear the brunt of negating their lived experiences and desire to belong to the world outside. I'll share a quote from a professor named Thomas Crisp, who researches on children's literature. He says, I'm sharing this quote particularly to show the absence of the representation of LGBTQ characters in young adult fiction or children's literature. So he says, I graduated from high school in the late 1990s without having been exposed to a single book with LGBTQ characters. The only exposure to LGBTQ issues I recall from my 13 years spent in the public school system came in the form of abuse from my peers, that is being called a fag or being beaten up in the hallways, and teachers, that is my elementary music teacher, who told me I could no longer perform a solo in my school's video for troops serving in the Persian Gulf War because I was acting like a girl when I sang. Not once I did see a positive depiction or reference to LGBT people. In fact, any discussion of LGBT issues or identities was actively censored by school officials, uncaught. While censorship from educational, religious, and legal institutions makes it almost impossible for children and adolescents to learn about a positive LGBTQ character, sources like the Lambda Literary Awards allow one to explore and learn about LGBTQ people and their stories. That is all. These are the different observations that I could make by looking at the various literary categories that are listed under the Lambda Literary Awards. Thank you for patiently listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that very exhaustive, educative presentation. I'm sure those who are researching in this area have really been put on a trajectory of research through your work. So thank you so much. And I think we can take all the questions right at the end. So we can move on to Monica's presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Is my screen visible?
Yes, good evening, Monica.
Is my screen visible?
Let me introduce Monica. So, Monica is from Jharkhand University, and she is Jharkhand. So, over to Monica. You've presented before, also, isn't it, in our forum?
Yes, I
Yes.
did.
So she's not, alien to us, and she's so welcome once again, Monica. And over to you.
Thank you so much. So without wasting any time, I would jump right into my presentation. As you can see, I have titled this particular presentation as Closeted Identities, Disintegrating Lives, Reading Chinelo Oppurantas Under the Udala Trees and Happiness Like Water. So there are two books of Chinelo Opuranta that I'm going to talk about in today's session. One is a novel, as Lisa ma'am has already introduced these two works, and other is a collection of short story. So before moving into this particular presentation, I thought it would be good if I talk to you about two of the important quotations that I found on Lambda Literary Association. And these two quotes that you see on your screen, it is talking about why Lambda Literary Awards, or the Lammies, it is essential in our day. The first point is that it is garnering, or it is attracting all those national, it is bringing in a national visibility for LGBTQ books, which is necessary in the present day and age, as it keeps on increasing all the discourses associated with the queer world, if so to speak. So as for me, I did not really understand uh, what the queer people had to go through um, in their lives until I read them. So that is why I believe that Lammies, or the Lambda Literary Awards, it becomes very essential by bringing in all those voices we might which we might not have come across if it was not for these awards. So the two books that I am going to talk about, they won in 2 different years. The first being Happiness Like Water, the collection of short story by Chinelo Opparanta, which won in 2014. It was for the 26th Lambda Literary Awards. Then after this, in 2016, her novel Under the Udala Trees, it won in the 28th Lambda Literary Awards. So these two books, Chinelo Opparanta is essentially a Nigerian American author. So the place that I am talking about in today's session is this place called Nigeria, which is in the African continent. So Nigeria is basically a mainly Muslim north and a largely Christian south. So these are the majority religions, so to speak, that one would find in this country. And if we look at the statistics of the religions that are there in Nigeria, you can see that 49.3% of Christians with 48.8% of Muslims. So why I am talking about the religious aspect of Nigeria, it will become very clear when we move into the two books that I am talking about today. So if you would look at the right-hand side of your screen, there is a map of Nigeria. So in this map, the dark green color that you see in the map, these are those places, those states in Nigeria which does not have Sharia law. Sharia law, if you know about it, it is basically a body of religious law that forms part of the Islamic traditions. And as I said, that there is a Muslim majority in Nigeria in the north. So that is the law that governs those states along with the state laws. So the green colored region in the map, there Sharia plays no role in the judicial system. Then the yellow region in the map, Sharia law, it applies, but only personal issues such as for marriage, for divorce, inheritance, and child custody. But otherwise, the legal system is very secular. And then coming to the last region, the uppermost northern region of Nigeria. So these are the states where Sharia laws applies in full, including in personal status issues and criminal laws. So the 12 northern states that you see in these regions, they adopt Sharia's law, and according to this law, homosexuality has the punishment of what the Islamic religion term as rajam, or death by stoning. And as recently as in July 2022, 3 men who were aged 20, 30, and 70, they were sentenced to death by the judge, and none of them were represented by lawyers, and all of them, so to speak, had confessed to their crimes. Then when we come to southern part of Nigeria, the maximum punishment that is there for same-sex sexual activity is 14 years of imprisonment. So more or less, if you would see both in the northern part of Nigeria and in the southern part, homosexuality is a crime, and it has been mandated by the government. So Chinelu Okparanta, basically in her novels, basically she is talking about how religion has a crucial role to play. But before moving to the religious aspect, I just wanted to give a brief overview of the political status of homosexuals or in Nigeria. So the Same-Sex Marriage or Prohibition Act of 2013, this called for 5 years imprisonment for anyone who performed or witnessed or aided in a same-sex marriage. It also prohibited any display of a same-sex of the same-sex relationship and adoption of children by gays or lesbians. And then 5 years of imprisonment are there for involvement in public advocacy or associations that supports the rights of lesbian and gay people. Also included in this bill is a proposal to ban any form of relationship with a gay person. And a person who registers, operates, or participated in gay clubs or in lesbian clubs or societies or organizations, or directly or indirectly they made public show of same-sex relationship in Nigeria, they commit an offense and they are liable to conviction on a term of 10 years. So moving to the next slide, if you would see, this is a chart that Pew Research Center had come up with in 2007. So according to the 2007 Pew Global Attitudes Project, if you would see to the right-hand side of your screen, at the bottom, you would find Africa, and there you would see Nigeria at the far end of this chart. So according to this chart, you would see that 98% of Nigerian residents believe that homosexuality is a way of life that society should not accept, which, if you would look at this chart, was the highest rate of non-acceptance in the 39 countries that were surveyed. So maybe we can take it as a positive, take it on a positive note that in the 2019 poll, this number of 98%, it decreased to 93. So these are an excerpt from the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria 1999, wherein you see that it is clearly mentioned that every citizen shall have equality of rights, obligations, and opportunities. Then there is a talk about the sanctity of the human person and of human dignity, and that the governmental actions shall be humane. So talking about seeing the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, although these are there, but more or less these are applicable for the heterosexual society. So coming to the author, about whose two works I would be talking about in today's presentation, Chinelo Okparanta. She was born in 1981 in Port Harcourt, which is also the setting of her novel Under the Udala Trees. So in 1991, at quite an early age, she moved to USA with her family. And it was there that she did her Bachelor of Science, her MA, and her MFA from America. So her debut publication was Happiness Like Water, which was published in 2013. And like I have already mentioned, it is a collection of short stories. Then came Under the Udala Trees in 2015, which was her debut novel. And I will be talking about both these works in a while, but at this point I would want to bring your attention to her recent publication, that is Harry Sylvester Bird, which was published in 2022. So this novel, it opens with the teenaged Harry Sylvester Bird, who is on an African safari with his supremely racist and entitled parents. So Harry Sylvester Bird is a white person, and back home in a small Pennsylvanian town, this book reveals depths of parental awfulness, and he flees to college in New York City, where he has to deal with the pandemic, the growth of a white supremacist movement, and his general awkwardness. Because although he is a white man, he identifies himself as a Black. So more or less, it is an equivalent of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, although I would not even think about comparing these two books, because The Bluest Eye was deeply enmeshed in year-long histories. But Harry Sylvester Bird's the way he was dealing with his life, he was navigating his life in this particular book, it is worth mentioning here. So coming to her novel first, Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Okparanta. It opens during the Nigerian Civil War, which happened in 1967, and which began in 1967 and ended in 1970. So Nigerian Civil War was basically a conflict between the Hausas of the north, the Muslim region that I showed to you in the map, and then there was the Igbos in the southern part of Nigeria, that who are basically they practice Christianity. So this Nigerian Civil War, in a country like Nigeria, where there are more than 250 ethnic and tribal populations, there this war, it was basically a conflict of what happened, of an ethno-religious conflict that a Nigerian Civil War became. So Chinelo Okparanta, in one of her interviews, she says that her mother had watched her father die in this same war, in a very similar way that the protagonist's father in Under the Udala Trees also dies. So she is referring to the 1967 Biafran War in Nigeria, and it was a very catastrophic, especially for Igbo people who had tried to secede from Nigeria and form their own nation of Biafra. So there are some of the characters that I would like to introduce you to before going into this novel. That we have our narrator, the young Igbo girl Ijeoma, Adaora, her mother, Uzo, her father, who had died as soon as the novel begins. In the first 3-4 chapters itself, he had died. Then there is Amina, the Hausa girl, who Ijeoma falls in love with. And there is also Nadidi, who Ijeoma later falls in love with, and she is a school teacher. Then there is Chibundu, Ijeoma's husband, the person who Ijeoma later marries, and Chidinma is the daughter of Chibundu and Ijeoma. So in one of the reviews of Under the Udala Trees, Lucy Popescu mentions that Under the Udala Trees is basically a very narrow reading of the Bible. She suggests is partly to Nigeria's vicious treatment of the gay community. And this is what you would find in the novel, where there is a constant conflict that is being shown with Ijioma's sexuality, and how Adaora, her mother, is trying to bring her back to the heterosexual way of life, by by showing certain passages from the Bible as examples that Ijeoma can adhere to, and the life that she is now living as straight, it could come back to its, so to speak, normal life. So I would only be able to focus on certain aspects of the novel that associates itself directly to lesbianism. So in the novel, Chinelu Parhanta very beautifully captures it, that love is basically a combination of friendship and of infatuation. That the feeling that she had for Amina, or for the the school teacher Nadidi. So both of them were basically a combination of friendship and infatuation, rather than being a homosexual kind of relationship or of naming. So there is the transgression of taboos that is being talked about in the novel, that that Ijeoma says that I did not know, and I did not know until I did not until then know that a mouth could make me feel that way when placed in that part of the body where I had never imagined a mouth to belong. So here there are two aspects that is being talked about. First is the sexual pleasure of a woman that is being put up in a cage, and there is also of a woman identifying herself as a lesbian. That genital is not explicitly mentioned in this particular lovemaking scene between Amina and Ijeoma, but in this scene itself, you see the realization that Ijeoma is coming across. So a rewriting of the biblical text is at stake because of this analogy. So later she talks about in the novel that Ijeoma is saying that we were naked and we felt our nakedness as Adam and Eve must have felt. And the grammar school teacher, he lectured and he lectured and he lectured as God must have lectured Eve. So the same analogy of from the Bible. Then Ijeoma goes on a witch hunt against herself because of her mother's constant pressure of trying to come back to a straight life, so that she is like the other, so to speak, normal people around her. So her mother's force in teaching the verses from Bible is because Ijeoma can have what maybe Adrian Rich called as compulsory heterosexuality. So Ijeoma wanted to pray so hard that she can walk on the way her mother and her society was showing her, but she could not because she was not able to. Her sexual encounter with Amina was not by force. She was repeatedly told by the grammar school teacher that she and Amina did not think anything of the act of love making, meaning that it came to them very naturally. But again and again, throughout the novel, she is being rebuked by the people around her for her relationship with Amina. So, in short, if I have to express what happens in this novel in very short, I would like to go back to the poem of Lord Alfred Douglas, where he talks about two loves, in which he is basically talking about the, so to speak, unnamed kind of relationship that Oscar Wilde had in his life. And he says that the relationship Oscar Wilde has, it is the love that dare not speak its name. And true enough, in this novel, this lesbianism, the relationship that Ijeoma had with two different women in this novel, it is not being talked about by its name. Rather, it is being talked about as that sort of thing which is happening. So idioma slowly yields to an obligatory heterosexuality, and she said that she says that it is better to have one person miserable rather than two. So now, in the concluding part of the first novel, I would like to draw your attention to these Udala trees that you can see in the title itself. So there is an Igbo legend that spirit children who are tired of floating aimlessly between the world of the living and that of the dead, they take to gathering above Udala trees. And in exchange for the dwelling, they cause to be exceptionally fertile. In exchange for their dwelling, they make certain female who comes and stay under these Udala trees for even the briefest period of time. They cause them to bear sons and daughters, as many as their heart desires. So contrary to Ijioma's encounter with the Udala trees in this novel, where it is basically shown in a very negative light, that of the weight of tradition, she feels the Udala trees to be the weight of tradition that is pressurizing her life. So contrary to that sort of darkness that comes in Ijioma's life, originally Udala trees are considered to be very optimistic, as it is considered to be bearing of life. So the next book that I have here is Happiness Like Water, and it is a collection of 10 short stories, but I would not be talking about all the short stories. I will only be focusing upon those short stories in which this theme of lesbianism, so to speak, is there. So first off, why is happiness like water in this particular book? It is because many of the characters that you would find in this collection of short stories can only be happy at someone else's expense, and therefore they cannot hold that happiness for long. So there are examples of mothers who pressurizes their daughter to marry rich men, or there are also barren women in this collection who are preying on pregnant ones. These are just some examples because of which their happiness, it does not last very long. So heterosexual relationship in this collection, it is shown to be doomed, but once between women, it is shown to have hope, as is evident in the two short stories I will be talking about in brief, that is In America and Grace. So it is not that the queer relationship are painted in a very idyllic kind of in a very idyllic manner, but there is a distinct sense of optimism that you would find in the stories that feature romantic relationships between women, that is which is lacking in the ones that features relationship between men and women. So relationships with men and heterosexual marriage, it seems to be too steeped in patriarchal power dynamics that it does not really offer women any real options. So in Valhalla, the first short story I want to talk about, there is a character called Ezine who is barren. So she and her husband Chibuzu, they go to visit a Dibia who are healers on the outskirts of Port Harcourt. So Ezine explains the pain she feels when the couple has intercourse, and her pain is misunderstood, interpreted, and then again misinterpreted. The Dibia, of course, cannot help her get rid of the pain, but after coming back from the Dibia, Chibuzu forces himself on Ezine, and her cries or her moanings of pain, it is being understood to be the meaning, to be the moanings of pleasure. So in America, the short story, there is a constant reminder of the government's policing that we can see in under the Udala trees as well. That in here also the narrator's feeling for her love, for her beloved Gloria, is not called by its name. And as you can see on your screen, that Mama, the narrator's mother, she is calling it that sort of thing instead of naming it. So In here also there is policing, and if you would look at the second quote on your screen, that there were always mobile policemen who were looking for that sort of thing, men with men or women with women, and the penalties were harsh: jail time, fines, stoning, or flogging, depending on where in Nigeria you were caught. Another very interesting analogy that you would find in this short story is the comparison that is there between goat and yam. So the father of the narrator, he equates his daughter's relationship with Gloria as the relationship that goat has with yam. Um, yam is a very important vegetation for the Igbo people in Nigeria. So he says that when a goat and yam are kept together, either the goat takes a bite of the yam bit by bit or salivates for it. That is why when two adults are always seen together, it is no surprise when the seed is planted. What is so fascinating about this statement is that it is as if all the men and women share a relationship that a goat has with yam. So queerness, it is seen as a failure of one's ability to practice self-control. That is, those who are queer, they are not allowed to exist as people who engage in relationships with the same sex. Instead, they must fix themselves by overcoming a sort of destructive sexuality that is devoid of any love or tenderness. So the final story that I would talk about in very brief is Grace. In here, there is a relationship between two women. There is a professor of Old Testament, and then there is her student Grace. So in this short story, these two women, they are drawn to each other, and Grace is unable to tell her mother that she does not like men in a marrying sort of way. And that is why she is forced into an arranged marriage with a very prosperous Igbo man. And she reasons or rationalizes that happiness is like water, that we are always trying to grab onto happiness, but it is always slipping between our fingers. So the women here, they share a very brief moment of togetherness, and that is enough for the narrator and for Grace to reflect that the verge of joy is its own form of happiness. So Grace accepts that no happiness is possible for her and is content with being happy even in its incompleteness. So finally, coming to an end of this session, Chinelu Okparanta's works, they are unapologetically lesbian, post-colonial and feminist kind of works. So it examines the intersection that is there of a complex identity of a Nigerian lesbian and how Christianity and the Bible, they are actively weaponized against these people. So African nations under the Udala trees, by allegorizing war in order to critique both the ethnocentric and a very heteronormative aspects of nationalism, and by linking it with the chauvinisms of war, with the homophobia of the present, what is happening is that Chinelu Okparanta is showing that how the worst side of human beings that was seen during the war, it exists even after the war has ended. And this war between the heterosexual and homosexual people, the war that the heterosexual people have waged against those people who do not adhere to their norms, it is still going on, and it still is as bad as the war itself. So African nations in general, they show some of the highest rates of coercive rape, which is the practice of correcting a lesbian sexuality through rape. Although it is Nigeria itself in which there was the concept of male daughters and female husbands in pre-colonial Nigeria. That is, it was basically a woman-to-woman relationship, a woman-to-woman alliance was allowed. Although there was no talks of sexuality, it was commonly seen as a tool to elevate or help in economic structures. But there was a system that was of this kind that was there. So millions of gay people living in Africa, or if we come down, narrow it down, in Nigeria, they face a similar choice that the characters in both these works are facing. That if they stay in Nigeria, they either have to repress their natural sexuality or risk losing their liberty and their lives. So the legacy of colonialism is alive. And as a character from Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo says, that it is homophobia, not homosexuality, that was imported to Africa because European missionaries regarded it as a sin. Take Angola. Prior to colonial intervention, homosexuals were accepted, they were not prosecuted. It was the Portuguese who criminalized it. And finally, ending with this thought of mine that I have always thought about, that it is, when we talk about heterosexual relationships, it is basically defined, or we talk about the love that the heterosexual couples have for each other. But whenever there is a talk of homosexual relationship, it is almost always defined by whom the homosexual person is wanting to have sex with. So that was all I wanted to say. Thank you so much for listening so patiently.
Thank you, Monica, for that exhaustive presentation, taking us into the humanity of lesbian writers. Um, Now the floor is open to participants who would like to ask questions. And I think even from Queen Mary's College, we have a researcher who's working in this area, Nivedita Jairaj. So there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who would love to participate in this discussion. Any comments, observations? I was also thinking about Ismat Chughta's writings. Whether she got an award for that, I'm not sure. Yes, Lisa, you want to ask a question?
Well, about Smith Chiptai, even I'm not sure whether she won any award, but I remember that for that particular work, she was taken to a trial at the court, and the judge happens to tell her that. I don't remember the exact word, but then the understanding is that sophisticated women like you should not be writing about such profane subjects. For Monica, I'm just curious about one aspect of your research. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm just curious about the way in which this writer presents its main characters. What's the kind of relationship that the main characters have with their religion? So I heard you saying that it is especially Christian religion and Bible often are used as a weapon by the larger society to suppress these sexual desires and voices. But when we look at writers like, say, for instance, James Baldwin's The Room of Giovanni, so there we see a play with the biblical story, the story of the relationship between the David and Jonathan. So Giovanni happens to be the Italian name for the name Jonathan. So there's a play with that biblical story. So we see Baldwin taking that biblical story and then appropriating it to suit the situations that he is writing about a relationship between two men's sexual relationship. So my question is like, what kind of a relationship the main character would have towards their religious identity? Of course, it is suppressive when the parents present it. Just like in the novel The Room of Giovanni also, for David's father and father's idea of the Bible and biblical values loom large over him. But still he finds a way to come to terms with the Christian religious identity. So what sort of a relationship these main characters have with the Bible and also their Christian religious identity? I'm just curious about it.
So I would not say anything about James Baldwin because I think I read one of his works very long back to comment anything about him. But focusing only on Chinelu Upparanta in the novel itself, I found that there are very interesting ways in which the main character is seeing, for example, the relationship that Adam and Eve had. And in the novel itself, she is saying that maybe if we are seeing certain portions from the Bible as allegories, as a way that God is teaching human beings a way of life. So can't we see that the relationship that Adam and Eve had with each other, it could only be a symbol of companionship rather than being a relationship between a man and a woman. So the author itself, in numerous interviews, she keeps on telling that she basically grew up in a as a Jehovah's Witness. That is, they believed in not in the Holy Trinity or in they believed in the God. So the interpretation of Bible that is being shown, if it is the case for Ijeoma or the professor of Old Testament in one of her short stories also, both of them keep on telling that the meanings that is being derived from Bible, it was set in a point of time that was culturally and with respect to time period was very far from what we are actually living in. And so it is important for us to reconsider the notions that are already there and see, maybe come up with a new sort of understanding. So on most of the characters of Chinelu Upparanta, I see that although they are having a conflict with Christianity, with God, with Bible, because of this constant pressure on them of the society. But despite that, they seem to go back again and again to God, but in their own sort of ways, rather than trying to imbibe what society around them is trying to tell them.
Thank you, Monica.
Actually, we have experts on this forum, and one of them is Shreya. So, may I request Shreya to uh, share some of her knowledge in this area? Because we do have scholars who are very interested in learning more about this.
Good evening, everyone. I thought, Dr. Maria, that maybe we would speak at the end. There is one more speaker now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we could do it at the end.
Yes, you could wrap it up. Yes.
Yes.
Do we have one more speaker on the panel today?
Yeah. This is Sandhya, ma'am. Sandhya.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm quite disoriented today, I must admit. So, Sandhya.
Yeah, it's all right, ma'am.
Yeah. So let me introduce Sandhya. She's from Presidency University, Bangalore. So Sandhya, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I am unable to share my screen.
I'll give you a sharing right.
Yeah. Yeah, I can share my screen now. Ma'am, is my PPT visible?
Yes, yes.
It is visible. All right. A very good evening to everyone. The title of my presentation is Nexus of Identities, a critical study of We Have Always Been Here, a queer Muslim memoir by Samra Habib. Why I have chosen this particular memoir because it talks about how important it is to be independent, how important it is to empower oneself. At the same time, personally speaking, it has guided me, it has inspired me in so many situations. Uh, so that's why I think I'm very lucky to choose this novel. At the same time, it is a recipient of Lambda Literary Award too. So I guess that's why this memoir is a very important memoir that needs to be learned and to be understood. One second.
Sandha, if you will put it on the full screen mode, please.
Yes. Yeah, 1 second, ma'am. That is better now, ma'am. Right now it is full screen mode for me. Is that
yes, perfect?
Yeah, okay, ma'am. Lambda Literary Award. So in short, this award is called as Lammys. And what it does is that it brings out the crucial role played by the LGBTQ writers in shaping the world. It also tries to bring out the outstanding contribution done by these queer writers to queer culture, queer literature, and community. It has 24 different award categories, and some of them are gay lesbian fiction, gay lesbian memoir, poetry, bisexual literature, transgender literature, graphic literature, and many more. This memoir receives the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Memoir or Biography in the year 2020. So, this memoir talks about the personal experiences of Samra Habib. And why this memoir receives this award is because it talks about talks about her journey from being completely powerless to empowering herself. Shamra Habib was born and brought up in Pakistan, and she is forced to migrate to Canada because of Ahmadiyya intolerance. But when she was growing up in her childhood, she witnesses how Pakistani women, especially her mother and her sisters, are forced to perform subservient gender specific roles. Samra, who also has same experiences, empowers herself and embraces her feminine identity as she stands up against the challenges brought by patriarchal, familial, and religious power structures. She also realizes that she might not be a heterosexual. At the same time, she again receives multiple challenges through heteronormative structures and religious structures. As she learns to embrace her identity and as she learns to come out, she also realizes that she needs to represent queer Muslims. So that is why she becomes an activist. She travels to places and she gives speeches. She also uses photography to not only represent queer women but also represents the almost non-existent nature of queer Muslim representation. And that is why the whole concept of representing them, the representing of queer Muslims, and that is one of the reasons why this particular memoir receives Lambda Literary Award. So what I've done is I have used intersectionality theory. So we all know that our society has so many dominating ideologies, institutions, and traditional scripts. And these scripts, these institutions are used to sustain the societal inequalities and injustices. But then there are so many people, so many individuals with multiple social identities, such as sexual identity, gender identity, racial identity, and religious identity. And these minority identities are used to discriminate them. For example, we have Kimberly Crenshaw. In her book, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. So what she does is she uses intersectionality to bring out the neglected representation of Black lesbian women. So when she brings the representation, she tries to bring out three identities, that is the gender identity, racial identity, and sexual identity too. So this is what intersectionality does. It brings multiple identities. It doesn't focus on one single identity, but it talks about two or more overlapping identities. Intersectionality also examines the contextual, political, and social power structures of inequality and injustice faced by multiply stigmatized communities. That is why intersectionality talks about multidimensionality, that is, multi-paradigmatic identities. By bringing in multiple identities, it examines how oppressive structures, oppressive hegemonic structures, they discriminate these minority identities by drawing the data, that is, by drawing on the data of individual experiences. I'm not only talking about multidimensionality, but I'm talking about how these identities are dependent on each other, how they are related with each other. So that is why these three tenets becomes the core of intersectionality. So what I am doing in my analysis is that I'm using Samra Habib's experiences, how she is discriminated because of her gender, sexual, and religious identity. She is discriminated by patriarchal and heteronormative power structures. She is also discriminated within her own family, within her community, outside her community, and also by religious structures. So when I am analyzing Samra's identity, she is a queer Muslim woman. So when I say a queer Muslim woman, I'm talking about three overlapping identities, that is gender identity, queer identity, and Muslim identity. So first I'll be talking about gender identity, and then I'm going to talk about queer identity. When I'm talking about these two identities, I'm going to explain how religion plays a conflicting role from the beginning, and from the beginning to the end of the memoir. It flows throughout the gender and queer identity. Uh, at a very young age, she realizes that Pakistani women are subjugated by the patriarchal power structures. She notices how her mother's name is changed. So, her mother's name is changed before her marriage by her husband, and the mother didn't even know that the name was being changed. So, Samra talks about how Samra's mother is a representative to all other women, where their free will is up for grabs by the male members of Pakistani society. She talks about how women have to perform the diurnal tasks of being a mother and being a wife. At the same time, she talks about how women were told to be, quiet, wear burqa, to be the good Muslim woman. And they're not supposed to talk loudly, they're not supposed to be opinionated. And that is why in Samra's house, when the father leaves the house, the house is celebrating. Samra's mother and the three daughters, including Samra, they turn up the volume of the TV and they start, dancing and singing, because they are relieved. They have some kind of freedom after the male member has left, has gone to work. Samra is also forced to take on the role of a nurturer when she's asked to look after her sisters. Again, we see how at a very young age, Samra is, manipulated into internalizing heterosexual gender identity. Women are also asked to, take on hobbies such as knitting, cooking, stitching, because they tell them that they have to be between the four walls of their house. So basically, female identity was all about being a good Muslim woman, birthing children, male children, that is wearing hijab, and especially maintaining non-confrontational and non-provocable behavior. And if they did not follow this, they would be domestically abused. If not, they would be killed. Shamra Habib talks about how she has seen lanes, filled streets filled with women's dead bodies, because they could not give birth to male children, or because they did not listen to their husbands or the male members of the society. At the same time, the good Muslim woman identity is repeatedly used to manipulate them and perform gender submissive roles. They are told that if they wanted to reach heaven, then they had to do gender specific roles. Only then they would go to heaven. At the same time, they are deprived of decision making power and autonomy over their body and mind. Samra is also not allowed to go outside her house because she is told to fear her own gender. Because if she was outwardly, if she was wandering here and there, and if something happened, that was because of her fault and not the men's fault. She talks about how when her mother and the daughters traveled in the public space, the Pakistani men would catcall, they would howl, they would hiss, they would point out, their fingers at, the body of their mother. But then Samra's mother, who is so scared, she would actually raise her burqa, to show only her dismissing eyes, and hoping that somehow she would protect herself and her daughters. The minute she gets these kind of encounters, she holds her daughters very very tightly, hoping somehow that she is protecting her own daughters. But then irony is, when Samra is molested, the role of her mother basically, the mother takes the daughter and clinically examines Samra. Her touch felt cold and clinical. Once she determined that my hymen had not been broken, she uncovered her face by taking off her burqa. Finally, she could breathe as deeply as she needed to. So this clinical examination and her mother's relief talks about how she is worried that her a daughter, if she is a virgin or not. Virginity is so important because if she was not a virgin anymore, then this would ruin her marital prospects, right? But then what happens to Samra? What happens to her psychological trauma? What happens to her physical trauma? Right? These are the things that are, that is something that her family does not worry. Her mother, being a woman herself, does not worry about her daughter's psychological trauma. Due to Ahmadiyya intolerance, Samra and her family moved to Canada. But then when she moves to Canada, Samra, who is already suffocated by the gender typical roles, by the gender submissive roles, she begins to act out. She wears cosmetics, she removes her hijab, attends parties, talks to boys, and her father especially tells her that she is a wild person, that she is untamable. After this, she is forced to get married, but then she consents to get married anyway because she has to. She is forced to maintain her family's honor. So this consenting is because how she has internalized gender norms of patriarchy and also Islam, right? Even though she knows that she will have to perform the hegemonic gender role expectation, she still consents, because if she didn't, then she would be either exiled, or she would be disowned basically. right? But then after her marriage, her husband polices her. Samra used to love reading, feminist books, especially feminist books. But then every time she's reading books, her husband would take the book and check what kinds of words these books had, and if these books had words like kissing, sex, or holding hands, then he would immediately retrieve that book. Her husband also said that reading books not only polluted her mind, at the same time, it promoted not only individual independence but marital independence too. So it's very clear how intellectual skills and gender specific roles, they did not, they weren't incompatible with each other. As her marriage becomes very suffocating, she is unable to tell her parents that she wants to get divorced. But then she also realizes that her husband was, totally okay with domestic abuse if she did something wrong. So Samra, who read feministic books, Samra, who always, who was rebellious, who wanted to stand on her own feet, realizes that she cannot live like this anymore. She actually attempts suicide, but then as she attempts suicide, she realizes that she cannot, her suicide fails, and this is when she realizes that she cannot be weak minded, she cannot be dependent. So she gets divorced and she moves out of her house. And when she moves out of her house, uh, what happens is she is not allowed to go to the mosque. At the same time, she is not included in the Muslim community. And one of the important aspects of her moving out is she removes her hijab and she keeps it in her house and she abandons the house. I think this is what happened in Iran also recently, isn't it? How the hijab confines them into doing gender typical roles. This is what happens to Samra also. She leaves her hijab to say no to patriarchal society, to say no to stringent religious, doctrines. So she completes her education, she empowers herself, and she learns to embrace her feminine identity. So as soon as she embraces her feminine identity, she begins to realize that she is more attracted to women, right? So this is when she thinks that she might be a lesbian. She realizes that when she was a child, she used to be attracted to a childhood friend named Sonia, where they used to touch each other's body and they were intimate. When she was growing up in her school in Canada, she used to also peek at girls while they were changing their dresses in the changing rooms. But then, even though she realizes that she might be a lesbian, she might be a queer, she is unable to embrace her identity because she has already integrated a heterosexual identity. At 16, she is forced to get married. How can sexual maturity happen if the sexuality is decided for you? At the same time, her body is scripted, it is policed, it is maintained by the hegemonic structures of patriarchal structures, heteronormative structures, and religious structures. So all these structures does not allow her to embrace her queer identity. And then, as I said, religious identity, faith, and I. So she realizes that she who was born and brought up in the Islam religion, she realizes that Islam culture does not recognize queer sexualities, right? Because it gave more importance to heterosexual practices and procreative practices. At the same time, Islam gave more importance to the divine nature of family. Preserving familial honor, respecting elders are also very important. And at the same time, Muslim community is closely knitted. So if a person said that he or she might be a queer, then the dishonor would spread throughout the society, and the entire community would show their disapproval against them. At the same time, if they told that if they came out as queer, then this was understood as they were failing the ideals of what an individual identity is. It also questioned the familial, familial upbringing. Their upbringing basically, and she is definitely not following the traits of good Muslim woman, right? A good woman and good Muslim woman, they are interchangeable. So may it be patriarchal structures, may it be heteronormative structures, and especially her Muslim identity, her religion forces her to not even think of embracing her queer sexuality. But then, as she is suffocated again and again, she realizes that just like she embraced her feminine identity, she needs to explore her queer identity also. She begins to date queer men actually, but then again, she is following the heteronormative script here, not the queer script, right? But then, talking to women, being intimate with women, beginning relationships with women becomes extremely harrowing and difficult for her. She realizes that being in Canada, being near her community, near her parents, is not allowing her to embrace her identity. So she chooses to travel from places to places, going to queer districts that gives more importance to queer community. So doing this, she learns what the queer lifestyle is. She goes to bars, she goes to queer gatherings, and she begins to understand what queer identity is. She also meets lesbians where she feels safe, where she feels secure there. She realizes that she is immediately respected. She's immediately belongs to the queer community, as they accept her for whoever she is, maybe in terms of her gender identity, maybe in terms of her religious identity, or in terms of queer identity. She is accepted. uh, Samra, who thought she was an asexual, she thought then that she is a lesbian, and then she realizes that she's not even a lesbian, but she is a queer, where she is more interested in women and less interested with men. As she explores her identity, she begins to date butch, femme, and non-binary individuals. So as she begins to integrate homosexual, that is queer identity, she realizes that just like her, there are so many other queer Muslims who are going through same kind of conflicts, in their life. So that's why she takes up photography to represent queer Muslims. But then, irony here again is that photography is considered to be sin. It is prohibited by the Islamic religion, especially through Hadith. It says that photography is a sin. But then she uses photography itself to contest against the normative heterosexual and stringent religious practices. This is when we realize that Samra's identity is, her identity has so many layers. She is discriminated in terms of her gender identity, her sexual identity, her racial identity, and religious identity also. After the 9/11 incident, South Asian individuals were considered as terrorists. So their religious identity and definitely their racial identity too becomes the marginalized identity. So here we have four different layers of marginalized identities. At the same time, the queer community itself is a marginalized community, isn't it? So queer Muslim identity is marginalized in the marginalized category. So if we consider queer community to be mainstream, then queer Muslim identity is marginalized. So indirectly marginalized in the marginalized community. So I think we can see here there are 5 different layers of identities where Samra, who also represents queer Muslims, are discriminated. So intersectionality theory talks about this identity as intersectional invisibility. So Samra tries to bring voice, tries to represent queer Muslims, that just like her title, that we have always been here, that we have deemed to be invisible. That is why she uses photography to bring visibility. At the same time, she uses photography to bring out the religious persecution of queer individuals who used to have death threats, who self-exiled or exiled from their countries for simply being queer. But then, just like every other individual, we need we need some kind of faith. We need some kind of assurance, some kind of a belief system where where we need to feel belonged and to feel safe. So Samra, who was born and brought up in Islamic religion, she wants to go back to her faith. She wants to reconcile with Islam. So that is why she joins with the modernized version of a mosque, where she can be her true authentic self. She comes out in the newspaper, The Guardian, and she comes out to her parents also, who actually accepts her after so many years of sidelining and policing and oppression. This is how Samra empowers herself. She becomes an activist. She gives speeches. She uses photography to represent queer Muslims. Conclusion, certain individuals face several levels of marginality. So it can be in terms of ethnicity, it can be in terms of gender, sexual identity, and religious identity. And some of those, hegemonic institutions are patriarchal structures and heteronormative structures. Also, in the situation of queer Muslims, they are subjugated within their family, within their community, and the larger context of the society also. But then, just like Samra's experiences, just like how she voices out, intersectionality theory also helps to peel multiple layers of oppression. So, thereby giving representation, thereby giving voice. So my last slide, here I am. To conclude with, I would like to use a quote. Maybe being a woman could be a source of power for me. Uh, what we feel like to walk through the world, daring to present myself without apology. So here it's not just about feminine identity, but it's also about queer identity, wanting to be who we are, wanting to embrace our true authentic identity. Because my femininity had often been exploited by others and used as justification and controlling me. She talks about how many structures kept on discriminating her. I understand how showing off my curves could allow me to take back the power from those who had stripped me of it. My body could be a source of joy and pride. It was for me and for me alone. This is where Samra Habib says that decisions or scripts according to her her body, her sexuality was hers alone. This was her decision. It was her wanting. By saying this, I would like to conclude my presentation. I would like to thank Queen Mary's College for giving me an opportunity to allow me to speak. I would like to thank the PG and Research Department of English for giving me this opportunity. I would like to thank Shreya ma'am and especially my supervisor, who is actually a source of light for me. He always tells me to be fearless and talk my mind. Thank you, sir. And I would like to thank you everyone for being here and listening to me. Thank you so much. Yes, I think I've done with my presentation.
Thank you, Sandhya, for a very scholarly, passionate presentation, I should say. And I wouldn't stand between you and people who would like to learn more from you and the other presenters of the day.
Thank you, ma'am.
So yes, we can have some discussion.
Yeah.
If Shreya madam wants to say some things by way of observations, madam, you can.
Well, it is a special evening, particularly because the three speakers are very close to my heart. Lisa has been my colleague at one point of time, and someone whose scholarship I have always admired. Monica is my scholar at this point of time, and Sandhya today is the scholar of my first scholar, Kit, who is also here. So it has been special. I think session.
Ma'am, you're not clear. I can't.
Yes, the voice is breaking.
Good evening, Shreya ma'am. Your voice is breaking.
Are you able to hear me now?
No, ma'am.
No.
Is it better now?
Yeah. Now it's
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
yes, yes, ma'am.
Yes, madam.
Yes. This session, I think, was particularly important because we discussed a discourse which the world at large would want perhaps to be invisibilized. And when I began teaching, gay and lesbian literature at the university, one of the first things I noticed that how in a central university, students who are privileged and how deep the biases run, how deep rooted they are. So I would begin my classes by asking my students what they thought about.
Ma'am, we cannot hear you.
We lost you again, Shreya.
Am I audible?
Now you are, ma'am.
Now you are.
I don't know. I think there is some kind of an internet issue. So I would not take much time. I just want to say that this is a particularly important discourse because you penalize certain people for certain issues over which they have no control. And of course, that leads to a lot other of of complications. The way I see it, just like a person doesn't have control over one's skin color, similarly, one doesn't also have control over one's sexual orientation. Yet the world at large thinks that they can be penalized for it, and which has led to the kind of world that we are living in now, which is so structured, so exploitative, so checkered, so full of complexities, so full of persecutions. in fact, it is a very difficult world to live in. And I think all the speakers today have done justice to this very important discourse. Lisa has led us through the tapestry, through the complex tapestry and the politics of this area. Monica has located it in Nigeria and the complexities there. And Sandhya has done a beautiful work by showing us how these issues are there in our part of the world, and how one has to fight against desperate odds. I personally am deeply interested in these issues, and it always warms my heart to see young scholars working on these research areas. I think my connectivity is also poor tonight, so I think maybe we should throw it open to the scholars who are there today. Dr. Maria.
Thank you, Shreya, for placing things in perspective. And yes, openness, inclusiveness is what research is all about. So any observations from the other participants, any comments, questions? We have minutes before we close. And I invite you to join all our in tandem sessions. It's geared, as Shreya would endorse, it's geared at encouraging postgraduate students so it's actually an avenue for them to present and have an opportunity to
LX7.
to
Just go front and
yes, so,
take the first right. There will be LX7.
So over to the participants, the audience.
Yes,
anyone has a question?
This is Southgate, and you just go. There is a chalk, and then take the right. First right.
Yes,
I would request the participants.
Yeah,
to
yeah. I've muted. Yes, I've muted.
Yes.
So we can carry on with some discussion before we close.
Yes, I'm Srilata speaking.
Yes,
All the three, I think the papers were thoroughly researched and very, very well presented. Thank you, scholars, and good luck with all your research. Again, as I've already written, I just wanted to say that there was a time when people like Patrick White, he was a gay person. I worked on him for my MPhil. And there was, of course, as a researcher, we could see the sensitivity in those were different. But those writing, and he went on to get a Nobel. Those writings were not as open, maybe as it is in today's works. These works perhaps. So maybe
couldn't agree better with you, because right now I'm reading Oscar Wilde's The Portrait of Dorian Gray.
Yeah.
So it's
so even then we understood it was different because of the the sensibilities there in the work was different, and they still managed to get them going, maybe not so openly as it is today. So sometimes we wonder whether this world should be, all of this should be open to all kinds of people. Even children get to reading this. Maybe when they are old enough, if they read this, it doesn't mind this kind of works. We tend to think that anybody or everybody could choose the sexual aspect, choose their sex. Sometimes I do not know, or I'm still in the right, maybe with torn between tradition as well as research, right? And I keep an open mind, but yet there's some part of me that goes back to know the keeping things in their proper perspective. If that is what I call the way in which people in the past wrote, and people of the same kind, people who wanted freedom, people who fought for it, but then in a better way. So what is your opinion? If Ms. Shreya could talk about it, I think, but I don't know whether the participants can comment, but anybody.
Hitler criminalized it, he put many homosexuals into gas chambers. That is, common. I mean, many people know about that. So yes, as Shreya was saying, this kind of rejection or criminalization of sexual orientation should not be there.
No, I'm not talking about the criminalization or thing, and my representations of it in literature. Should it be open? I mean, we have because there is a particular award for it now. I am worried because
I was looking up the Lambda Literary Award.
Yes.
Right? There is something called young adult writing. That award for young adults.
I think somewhere everything is. Yeah, I'm not able to hear.
Yeah, Lisa wants to say something.
Yes.
Just a clarification, Srilata ma'am. So is the question, I'm just telling my understanding of the question, whether the question is, it is appropriate to give access to children to LGBTQ literature. Is that the question? If that is...
If it is written, if it is in the written mode, I mean, all kinds of people get access to this. See, particularly when people like, I told you, Patrick White wrote, I could get the sensitivities of a person through his literature, but that literature did not openly state many things to a child who was reading it. And then there was he got a Nobel even without the Lambda Awards, right? So now that there is a special branch of, prize, I'm more worried about the prizes being given, right? It's not, I don't question the right for people to express themselves. They have to, otherwise society wouldn't know their travails. But when awards are given for, a separate award is given for this instead of, I want the whole thing to be mainstreamed and let it come under the listing of what you call general literature instead of particular. I mean, when you make it particular, put it in a particular box like words that gay, lesbian, etc., it becomes a little worrying. Okay, if it is literature worth reading, let the Nobel or whatever that kind of prizes, I think let that continue. If it's so, it's not just students reading it; it's also how we assess, judge. Right. That is what I was.
Yeah, I'll just share my random thoughts. Even Preeti ma'am talked about Isma Chughtai Lihaf. When we look at that particular short story, it is told from the eyes of a small girl. So it clearly shows us that it's not that children do not encounter certain sexual intimacies or do not experience any of it. They do, but how do they see it? When for Isma Chughtai, it was easy to present the whole scenario in a very figurative manner by bringing in the metaphor of a quilt and then telling the story. Even for Virginia Woolf, also in Orlando, taking it to an imaginative level, it was, it was easy for her because she belonged to a highbrow literary cultural sphere. But when at the same time, on the other hand, there is this lived reality of people who do not get a chance to voice their experiences. Like, say, for instance, there is a film named Double XY. It's an Argentinian film. So in that film, we come across an intersexed adolescent. So it's not that we don't have an intersexed child or intersexed person amongst us. So when it comes to such very rare cases, for them to adapt into a society, it becomes very challenging. So it's not that we don't have intersex children or transgender children. There are boys who would like to dress up like girls. There are girls who would like to dress up like boys. But then when we discipline them, when we tell them that it is not normal, we are, in a way, it is psychologically affecting them. There is a psychological trauma that these children would undergo, and that would turn into different dangerous levels as they grow up into adults. Not in every case, but there is a chance of that also, wherein we see, because of the lack of acceptance of gay adolescent or lesbian adolescent, sometimes there is this turn to substance abuse also. So it's a situation wherein we need to think whether we want our children and even young adults. There would be rare cases, but still, in those rare cases, should we be denying them of their choices and freedom just because we want them to see growing up in a particular manner? So just because we don't accept a little boy dressing up like a girl, do we really want to traumatize the childhood, adolescent ages, and adulthood? That is the question. So I think this, even I'm an academic, even when I get to teach the undergraduate students, even I have such comms. I at one point wanted to introduce queer young adult fiction, but at the same time, I'm also still thinking about it. But after having thought much about it, I think it is fair to introduce such themes, because always children and young adults who identify as queer or LGBT often get often become victims of hate crimes. They get bullied at schools. They get bullied by peers and teachers. So when we stand from their position and think about the issues that surround them, probably we need such categories. Even when I have a small child of 10 years, so when I want to introduce such themes to him, I clearly want to look for literatures that are labeled as children's LGBTQ literature or young adults LGBTQ literature, because that gives a good perspective. Like, say, for instance, the novel that I referred to while giving my presentation, Aristotle and Dante. When Aristotle and Dante, it's an, I'm sorry, I'm not getting the title properly, but Benjamin science, a novel. In that particular novel, we see a very positive approach wherein adult parents are able to handle the problems that their queer children are encountering. So that kind of a possibility only these writers can actually offer. So it's good to have that kind of categories, is what I think. Sorry, I took a lot of time, it seems.
No, that's fine. But I'm just wondering, this category, I'm not against anything to do with teaching when it's about, I mean, at the up to the age up to adolescence, I think it is parents who monitor children, and so they should be the ones who should detect right? If there is, and for the child to come out with it, I think it will take up to adolescence, right? I don't mind up to after adolescence for child reading or anything like that. And under age child reading, I mean, getting access to books like this itself will be a little, till maybe till he also she becomes past adolescent, and by that time he would have framed, I mean, he would have known what his sexuality, or he or she, right, would they, when they have ideas about their sexuality, it is all right. But books to openly blare out, and that I wouldn't. And I would say that, having special awards like this for books, anything that is literature, truly literature, should come under general categories and not special categories. That is my, I'm not bothered about how we have to certainly bring in all those. We believe in inclusive kind of society where all these things are taken into account. We have to have other regarding virtues. We should know, whom to, how to treat. We have to teach our children how to treat people with disabilities or differences, or then as color or whatever it is. We have to, that is the, that's the society's role, right? Instead of saying, I'm not talking about all those differences. I'm talking about the, the special categories of literature that we have, like in all other things. We have these literary category, what do you call, award categories, right? That is where, even for a truly good movie, right, or a thing, we are now making specializations of everything and giving those awards. I do have a thing against those people. Stood out once, those who did, and they, irrespective of whether they were gay or lesbian, at a time when society was cruel to all of these people, right? Today we have a much a better society, I think, okay, which is aware of all these things. But we did have, so I'm just wondering with
Dr. Srilata.
Yes, okay, I
Yes.
think we can stop. We'll
Yeah.
continue. This will go
No,
on.
the thing is, yes, it's good to debate, and because it gets us thinking. And as I look up to you so much about that. That's why I'm so keen that you should be here on every in tandem meet, because in tandem is about young people, it's about young scholars, our postgraduate students, about mentoring them, and about worldviews. So actually, in wrapping up, I would like to, as you were talking, the words that came to me were about identity and representation. And as Lisa was saying, teenage is a time where they're looking for their identity. Who am I? And maybe young adult fiction in this area might be helpful. As to concerns from a parental perspective, all that is also there. But I'd like to wrap it up with what the Lambda Literary Award website says about who we are. It says, for over 30 years, the Lambda Literary has championed LGBTQ books and authors. No other organization in the world serves LGBTQ writers and readers more comprehensively than Lambda Literary. We believe that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer literature is fundamental to the preservation of our culture, and that LGBTQ lives are affirmed when our stories are written, published, and read. So as to the question about whether there should be a separate award for this, I come to it from my area of specialization, Aboriginal writing, where you have the David Unipan Award, Srilata. It is for Aboriginal writers. So that notion that there has to be a space where these voices are heard, and not that everything has to be necessarily mainstream. Probably that would also answer this question about a space for the LGBTQ community. And of course, we've had great writers like Patrick White, Oscar Wilde, who had to keep their identity under wraps in the times that they lived in. So I think we have enough food for thought on this area,
Yes.
and we can meet again on the 30th of December.
Thank you.
So thank you, presenters, and thank you to each and every one of you who attended. And forgive whatever lapses in coordinating to today's program, because I've had a very long and grueling day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you all. Bye. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Sandhya. Thank you, Monica. Very
Thank you, ma'am.
intellectually
Thank you so
stimulating
much.
papers. Thank you, Shreya. Shreya. Yeah. Okay, see you all. See you all on 30th. Bye.